Great, so we're going to get started right now. This is our second panel, Using AI to Automate Government. And we're starting on time for two reasons. One, we have a great set of panelists. I just like digging into material. And two, one of our panelists has to leave promptly at 3:30, so we want to make sure we stay on time. We have three panelists up here. Alex Chalmers, who's Director of Public Sector Vertical Sales at Amazon Web Services. Bill Eggers, Executive Director at the Center for Government Insights at Deloitte. And Justin Herman, who's the Emerging Citizens Technology Program Lead at GSA. And Justin's title belies the fact that he's really kind of shepherding pretty much all the AI projects across the federal government, or at least touching some of them.
This mic can't turn on fast enough.
Not technically true, no. But we are glad to support and help how we can.
So we're really just delighted to have all of you here today to discuss these projects. So as I said, we really want to focus on practical, and brass tacks. What can government be doing right now? And I'm saying government, of course, very broadly right now. The federal government, state, local government. We're talking about AI right now. What are the initial opportunities to use AI? Let's start with that question, then we're going to kind of branch into a lot of other areas. But Justin, let me start with you on that question.
All right, so one of the things that are always a great challenge is that there is a huge chasm right now between what is the public dialogue and public perception about AI and what the opportunities are today for federal agencies and what is actually achievable and what already is being done. Through GSA, we are working directly with over 300 unique federal, state, and local agencies and international partners to the Emerging Technology Program, all who have opted in to learn more, study, work on business cases, implement, test, and evaluate, and full scale things like artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, machine learning. And so a lot of times, and that's why it's great to be here today with these people, because too often we talk about this intangible visionary future of AI, and we don't look at the fact that right now, today, there are technologies and solutions that can directly impact any mission within the federal government. Now, of course, there'll be some centers that it's brought to closer, but everyone can be touched by this, and everyone can benefit, because what organization doesn't have data that exists that we can make more actionable and digestible for operations? So thank you so much for having us here today.
So yeah, but before we leave, I want to get some specific answers here. So I know you're doing this kind of AI, it's the technology atlas, right?
Yes, so that was actually one of the starts, is that people were asking specifically, like, what exactly are federal agencies thinking on this? From the sublime to the ridiculous, because it's a creative process, it's a new process for a lot of people. So we're seeing everything from projects around, from call centers, contact centers, right down to just processes where people aren't going to know that they're using AI. They're just going to know that their day went a hell of a lot better. And these are in just standard behind-the-scenes processes. We're looking at, for instance, an intangible, and this wasn't directly in my program, but I was happy to help them with it, is the pilot that Federal Acquisition Services within GSA did for the Fast Lane program. And that Fast Lane program is specifically for companies with new technologies that have not worked with government before to onboard them, and that process took a while. So they put out a pilot to say, how can we use like robotic process automation, AI, in order to make that better? The pilot worked. And we're seeing things like this all over government, of people coming in, new ideas from smart buildings to just removing and automating basic processes that sound basic on paper, but if it's the difference between something taking 20 days or something taking 1 day, that's a significant benefit. So really, like people say, is there a specific example? You could blindfold yourself, throw a dart in that direction, hit a barn door that way, and still hit something that we can make better within the government with these programs.
Bill, from your vantage point at Deloitte, what are you seeing in this space? I know especially Deloitte is focused on, and some of the other consultancies are looking a lot at robotic business process automation as a kind of early stage, and that is very different than the AI that you kind of read about in the paper on a daily basis.
First time I heard about robotic process automation was this guy, for the record.
So. There we go.
So just from a broad standpoint, and then I'll go into detail, there's no technology that's going to have a bigger impact on government, on business, on society over the next 10, 15 years than AI in all of its different forms. There's nothing that's going to be even close. It's essentially the equivalent of electricity during the Industrial Revolution. We'll probably start seeing some very big productivity increases based on it, and we will see a complete, I think, reimagination of work. How work gets done, how it gets rewarded, how you hire people, how you put together teams, and so forth, all based on these technologies in the similar way as we saw in the Second Industrial Revolution. Absolutely no doubt about that in many respects. And so when oftentimes people in government will say, well, that just seems too far away, everything's going to be smart, and all the software will have AI embedded in it. Amazon Web Services just had a big announcement about this yesterday, which is very exciting, and Alec will talk about. So getting down to the brass tacks, we did the first ever major data analysis looking at the impact of automation and artificial intelligence on the US federal government. We came up with a kind of really interesting way of data analysis to say, how are federal workers now spending their time? We actually didn't know that before. So we took data from the Department of Labor and OPM data, and we said the federal workers are now spending 4.3 billion hours doing various tasks across all the agencies. And we can tell you exactly which tasks that they were doing and which activities, all the way down to an individual sort of unit level. And it turns out that a lot of those tasks are documenting, recording information, they're communicating with people. There's a lot of paperwork kind of tasks. Based on the model that we developed, we believe that over the next 5 years or so, using technologies that are readily available today, we could basically eliminate about 1.2 billion labor hours, free up 1.2 billion labor hours using these technologies. The equivalent of over really a day a week of someone's time, and cost savings of around $80 billion, and so forth. And then, so the way to think about it is the goal is to relieve people from doing a lot of the manual, mundane, menial sort of tasks that no one really likes doing, and so forth. They don't add a lot of value. Relieve them from that so they can spend more time actually on mission-related work, and then using machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, and other kinds of AI technologies to extend and augment human capabilities so we can do things that were simply impossible for us to do before. And that's the model, I think, to think about. And it's really, I think it's a model of the future that a lot of employees really look forward to.
Great, thanks, Bill. So I think AI has such great potential for the government. Government is primarily a service provider, and Bill spoke about that in his remarks. The billion hours that are freed up for those government workers to go do their mission-related work is tremendously beneficial to all of the citizens, and it's what we expect of our tax dollars at use. So some of the easy, low-hanging fruit, I think, of artificial intelligence for government is simple things like chatbots, right? Think about your normal, everyday online commerce experience when you go buy a certain product and you get a recommendation for another product. If you're on a government website and you're researching how to license your newly formed business, that's an opportunity for that government to offer other complementary services to that individual. Other service provider opportunities in government are just like caseworkers. There's a lot of studies done on caseworkers only doing about a third of their time serving their constituents. With AI technologies, we can free those people up to do what they want to do, which is go help our citizens. I think that's a real promise and future of our government services. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. So let me stay with you on this question of how it's going to transform the nature of government work. I mean, you talked a lot about getting rid of some of the paperwork. We've also, in the first panel, we were talking about a need for culture change in government in general. Are we seeing AI actually leading to actual transformation in the way workplace culture exists in government, in the sense that people often complain, government, I don't want a government job, it's just a bunch of paper pushing. That's kind of the stereotype. And in a sense, AI has that ability to potentially transform government organizations so that you are focused on those really interesting big problems? Am I attracting people?
Yeah, I think the challenge for government and the challenge for all of us really is this change in our thinking. I say it all the time. I come from a very legacy kind of IT background. I think we're all changing. We have to change our thought processes of how we deal with information. The CTO from Washington, D.C. that said, if we're going to allow a data set to be used financially or for monetary purposes, it has to go all the way to the mayor's office. I think that's an example of a legacy thinking that needs to be changed for governments, because I think access to data and the democratization of data is what's really going to drive more and more value. It's going to open up more entrepreneurs to come into your city or your locality, and you're going to provide better services to your citizens. Those are things I think from a cultural standpoint they need to change.
Let me stay with you on the DC point, because I think his point was that it goes to the mayor not to get access to the data, but to get access to monetize the data exclusively. So I just want to clarify that, unless I misinterpreted it, but I think we're good.
Okay.
So does that change your answer?
No, I just I think as long as data sets are put in the open more and more, I think you're going to see innovations that we can't even imagine today, because of technologies, honestly, like the cloud, that are kind of able to be utilized as a utility. So you have young children at points, you have entrepreneurs, you have college students creating new services that we probably can't even imagine today without the use of kind of readily available technologies that weren't available in the past.
Right. So Bill, I mean, you did your study, looked at all the billions of hours that could be saved. How would most organizations, government organizations, actually take that cost savings? What would they do with it? How would it change?
Yeah, so first of all, to your question, I think we're about in the first inning at the most in terms of the work sort of changes that are occurring. I actually think that the area where government is the most behind the private sector now is not in technology. It's actually in how work gets done and how work gets rewarded, how teams are put together, bringing together diversity of thought, bringing precision to those teams, and so forth. That is where incredible things are happening in companies, in sports teams, and others. And I think in government, we're still talking about job classifications and work rules and so forth. It's operating a little bit like a 1950s Fortune 500 company, when we need to be moving towards a 2020 kind of best-in-class Amazon-like company. That's a really big gap, and it's a gap that I'm very, very worried about when we look at performance. And so I think we need to start really thinking about that, and there's lots of incredible tools that are enabling people to do this. Now, when you look at the freed up labor hours, we have massive backlogs in some different areas, and we're going to be able to now get to those backlogs. Alec, you mentioned human services. There's actually the state of Colorado Department of Human Services did a study, and they found that actually 40% of all of the caseworkers' time was spent just doing paperwork, and less than 10% of their time was actually spent with children and their families. So we did another study looking at AI and human services and the whole life cycle of human services, and essentially how you can use either robotic process automation, machine learning, and other tools to dramatically change that whole process, save a lot of lives, and make a lot of lives a lot better. So that's, I think, the promise right now. But we have a far way to get there. And again, what we need to start thinking about in all of these different positions and all of these different activities is this notion of human to machine pairing. And what does that mean? What are the technologies available to take someone who's doing something now, or a team, and get 2x, 3x, 4x productivity and performance out of them based on some of these tools? And I'll talk in a little bit about some things that we've done out of my team, looking at federal government agencies that actually allow us to do that sort of thing.
So maybe you just want to pick up on that. If not, I'll prod you a little specifically.
Oh, no, like one of the things that I was fiercely writing down, because it's resonating so much. One of the main challenges we see, and truly we're going to all levels of organizations are interested in talking on this, all different flavors of organizations, is that we in the government, and I'm sure this is elsewhere, but I guess I've been in government too long to imagine life on the outside. That was supposed to be a joke, by the way. Okay, so.
You got your laugh.
Is that we like to compartmentalize things so much. And what happens is, so we're talking with organizations, and someone like, well, that's not really me. We're a cloud team. We're the cloud team for the agency here. Well, we're the data people. We come from the data culture. It's not AI. Right down to, websites and things like that. And what happens is, because we like to compartmentalize things, people don't see themselves within it. Forget about seeing themselves as stakeholders within these advancements. They can almost feel like they can ignore it and it might go away or it might not affect them, rather than see for what it is, which is this is going to be a piece of fabric that runs through every process, every team, every skill set. It's truly like an organization can't just be like, well, this is fantastic. I've got Johnny assigned over here to work on AI, so our team or our agency has it covered. This is like a mixed martial art, where we need diverse skill sets, diverse backgrounds, and diverse perspectives on how this will affect the processes, programs, outcomes, and if people aren't looking at that as a mixed martial art, that's when it falls short within your organization, or that's when it becomes stagnant. And not only can you not see that larger picture of all those benefits and all those low-hanging fruit that are just sitting there, but you won't be able to take them.
And I would say on the kind of low-hanging fruit that we were talking about, chatbots and robotic process automation. If you're an agency right now and you're hearing about this, maybe even for the first time, because some people still are, what do you actually need to do today? If you're saying, this sounds interesting, I want to do something in this space, what are you actually telling agencies? Here's your next 5 steps.
Don't read the hype. Or if you see an article and there's like a human hand reaching out godlike to touch what could be a Terminator hand, caveat that, throw some salt on it, because what'll happen is whether people are getting hung up on terminology, on the hype, on perspectives, things like that, is that there is a complete cloud holding over people sometimes from truly seeing things the way that there is and the way they have the process, like how they play their hand in it. So the first thing that we try to do with agencies is forget AI, forget robotic process automation, forget everything that could be a trigger word or is a trigger word, and just focus on your problem. Because in government, we don't have to look far to find things that we know can be better and that we've got the data for if we could just find ways to make it more actionable and digestible. Focus on the problem and be able to work it in such a way that maybe potentially something like AI could be a solution for. Because who knows, maybe the fact is you have something in your organization that could actually do it better or faster, and that is currently in reach. And the idea is to get people to focus on the problem, not on the technology, and right there, that's already doing half the battle.
I would just say, for some of these things, it's just getting started. And we are seeing, certainly within robotic process automation, we're seeing a lot of that happening. I mean, when you look at certain functions, we've done what we call process decomposition, where we've taken those processes and deconstructed them and said, okay, when you put in RPA and machine learning, what do they look like on the other end? And done tons of projects in the commercial sector and with agencies, like NASA is actually the leading agency in this right now, the federal government, but things like finance, HR, audit function, shared services, and so forth. We're talking about 100 to 200% time speed up, oftentimes 70, 80% cost takeout within some of those areas. And those are just getting started with some of those. They're repeatable, they've been done a lot of claims processing, invoicing, there's a lot of things like that. You could get some of this done in a couple months even and get started and then start to build it. But then the worst thing you could do is, for instance, just a whole bunch of like RPA projects all over the place and not have it as part of a bigger sort of work redesign. What does that actually mean? And looking at this over time. So that's got to be a piece of it where you need to bring in both the technology, the business owner, and the talent organization, HR organization together to kind of, again, rethink and reimagine some of these areas.
Yeah, so I would suggest if you're a government worker and you want to get started, you can just go Google Washington County, Oregon, and you can read a real live example of an information specialist at their sheriff's office who built out a facial recognition platform on our system. And it's one of those great stories. It's maybe not great from my position in some ways as a sales leader, but this person just went out on their own. We had made an announcement a couple days earlier around Recognition, which is our facial recognition service, and he went out, spun up a service, got the code, ingested a bunch of photos of known suspects, and while all of a sudden he had the wanted person facial recognition service up live and running. So I mentioned that obviously it's a self-serving example, it's an AWS example. I think if you're a government leader, I think what you need to do is really allow your people to fail, allow your people to innovate. I think that's the real benefit of the cloud, is the cloud allows someone, like the person in Washington County, go spin up an instance, go try some things out, fail, right? That's a key part of this. And I think it's also a key part of keeping your IT staff involved and invigorated as a federal or state and local worker, that you have access to these technologies, that you can really add value to what your mission is. You can do it very inexpensively.
So I want to stay on this question of what happens when you succeed. So you have people going out failing, and hopefully they're succeeding, hopefully you're getting the big savings. One of the challenges we saw in the past, especially with cloud computing, was that a government agency would adopt, they adopt cloud storage, or they move to a hosted email service, and then the savings were there to be had, but they didn't actually realize them because they had to, end a contract, they had to lay off some staff, they had to make changes internally to actually make those savings concrete. How do we attack that problem? Because that's the issue that makes this sustainable, is if you can actually not only say, well, we've saved time, and our budget has actually either gone down or we've redeployed it in this other way, but we can actually show it in the budget where the savings are.
So I'm gonna go back to my caseworker example, right? So if you talk to a young student who's studying in college today and majoring in sociology or social service, if you ask him or her, they're probably not saying, yes, I wanna do this and go do a lot of paperwork, right? They have ideals that they wanna help our society. So in cases where we can take healthcare workers in Colorado and deploy 40% more to help our citizenry, that's a win. Right, so I think, right off the bat, I think there's enough low-hanging fruit that we don't have to worry about this notion of competing with machines for our jobs. I think there's enough bureaucracy, honestly, in government and with paperwork, that we can free people up to do the things that they want to do, which is serve their communities.
And the big thing is never go it alone. Don't ever think that you are alone in this. You as a person, you as a federal agency, because I promise you that even if your agency thinks, well, we're pretty special about how we're approaching X, Y, and Z, that we can pair you up with about at least 5 other agencies that are thinking and asking the same thing. Right now, because of access, to greater amounts of data, the ability to store it, the ability to process it, things that we've been doing for a long time in the government are potentially in the hands of a lot of people. And there is not a lot of guidance or roadmaps forward in order to empower that. So right now, more than ever, we are working together across agencies and putting together government-wide coalitions in order to build those roadmaps and walk together and take those steps forwards. Whether it's you join the Emerging Citizen Technology Program like 300 other federal agencies and state and local agencies, whether you join a pilot program, I promise you again, and that's sort of the way in which, because if it happens in the dark, the tree falls in the forest and nobody heard it, did it actually fall, they say. Well, what happens is we see too many times people put together and go forward and take the risk and do all the due diligence on a pilot that then stays right there. And it doesn't spread, it doesn't grow forward, because again, they went it alone or didn't tap into some of it and didn't even know that some of these government resources exist for them to be able to take it the extra level. And so again, it's that's, I think, the big hurdle, that it's usually a perception thing, is people don't know how much there is just waiting for them to stand up and say, you know what, let's do this.
Let me follow on that, I agree, and give a couple real concrete things that I think we need to do in that respect. So first of all, when you look at this, I think the way to think about it is you have two different strategies you can use. One, which is a cost strategy, and then a lot of that is focused on cost takeout and so forth. And in that case, you also need to actually get those cost savings, you need to redesign work, you need to start using attrition over time. And when you say like a finance function, let's say you have 100 people doing it today, and you believe that over time you can get that down to 20 people, then you gotta figure out how you're gonna do that, reassign existing employees and so forth. Now the other strategy is more of a value strategy. And a value strategy is when you're looking at AI and automation and instead as a way of kind of augmenting the workforce and increasing effectiveness. So your focus first is on effectiveness as opposed to efficiency. And in that case, you still need to do the work redesign around what that actually means. And then you're looking at what are some of the, whether it's backlog or what are some of the unmet citizen, business, whatever needs now that we are not actually meeting today that we can meet in the future. And then that gets you there. The other way to think about all of this is I think when you look at, there's 4 different choices that we look at in terms of when you're looking at a process or activity and using AI. One, you can relieve. And that's where you're relieving, again, the manual, menial, sort of tedious processes, and there's a lot of relief to do in the federal government. The second one is splitting up the function. So as an example of that, take foreign language translation. It's made incredible gains over the last year in terms of Google Translate and others to where the translations are oftentimes 90% as good as professional translators, so you're splitting up that activity. So basically the AI is doing 90% of it, the translators are cleaning up the last 10%. Third is replace, and that's where it's a one-to-one replacement. Right now there's not a huge amount of opportunities for that, but there will be over time, and we've seen that. And then lastly, it's augment, and that gets to, I think, the most exciting part, which is really augmenting our human abilities and extending what we can do now, where we're doing these kind of able to go through massive data sets and massive amount of text, using computer to basically do things that simply weren't possible and help us make better decisions.
Great. So right now, I think there's kind of maybe functionally 2 types of AI in terms of there's off the shelf. So there's software and services that you can buy that incorporate AI that anyone can use, or there's kind of the roll your own. So there's as Alex, you were talking about, there's these cloud-based services or other algorithms you can use to integrate AI yourself and to develop your own solutions. Focusing on the off-the-shelf part of it first, are there opportunities now for us to start figuring out how to deploy that more broadly? Last year at Data Innovation Day, we had Dennis Mortensen, who's the CEO of X.AI, and his company basically created an AI-based virtual scheduler. So you interact with it just like you would a human scheduler to set all your appointments. That's it's a service that's now available for anyone at certain price points. To me, that's the example of AI or Google Translate, as you mentioned, that anyone can use now. How do we make sure that those services are integrated into government right away, and that people understand that they're there and that we're getting those cost savings? So, Justin, why don't we start with you and then.
Well, one of the things is just look to Federal Acquisition Services has just early on really pushed forward and embraced the role of emerging technologies, including AI, making sure that there's better contracting vehicles available and that people have a greater understanding of it. One of the things that we're actually working on right now, and it's probably going to be released next week, is a path to acquisitions resource for all emerging technologies, from robotic process automation, AI, blockchain, etc. Because the question always becomes, how do we move things from basic level test and evaluation and pilots and forward? And so through the U.S. Emerging Citizen Technology Atlas, we're going to be working on a one-stop shop that better educates not just federal agencies, but businesses who perhaps never have worked with the federal government before, to be able to navigate that field and open that up.
But right now, if you want to go and purchase one of these services, if you're in an agency, maybe you're CIO, maybe not even the CIO, you're just manager over a certain team. Can you easily procure these types of services? We can identify where they are.
Yes, and easier than people think. And so when we started this process of creating this new resource, like there was a lot of people who like I said, there's numerous vehicles that we're going to be mapping out, and not just the GSA, through Homeland Security, DoD, other functions. There's more than people think that are already available to them. So usually the question comes, how can we start making these things available? What we've really got to do is educate on how to use what we already have better, which is all part of the process, but it is the process that we are underway with.
I think the way to think about the more off-the-shelf sort of pieces, and then I do think getting into the custom is going to be interesting, is that think about it in different levels. So when you look at some of the big software providers, the Salesforce, SAPs, Oracles of the world, I mean, they're all spending huge amounts of money basically building AI into their systems right now to enhance those systems. It's the biggest initiative for all the software providers. So when you're, whether you're using those systems for the most right now and looking at the upgrades and so forth, or looking at them in the future, that's really a key feature to look at and could be a key differentiator. And then you've got a lot of, I would say, smaller companies, sometimes startups, but oftentimes a little bit beyond them that do right now a huge amount of work in the federal government. Oftentimes they're teamed with big kind of integrators like the Deloittes of the world and others, and they're providing some really, really interesting kind of more niche services. So around cognitive recruiting and management, where you're using AI to basically, as a recruiting tool, to get the best person for your team or to put together teams in the best way. There's companies like Shore People and Ascendify, which do that all the way from the onboarding process to who you're hiring all the way through in terms of learning. And then you've got another whole set of companies which are doing more of the RPA, automation, like Automation Anywhere and Blue Prism, and a variety of those sort of companies like that. So I think it's real important to then look at what are you trying to get done. But I just came from Silicon Valley, where I was there for 4 days, met with a bunch of the different companies. There's literally no company out there right now that isn't pitching themselves essentially as an AI company.
Even if they're not.
Yeah. But even, let me just give you one other example of like a really simple. When I met with this company called Butter AI, and what they're doing is they've created a system using machine intelligence and some NLP, which essentially just does something very simple. It basically, instead of when we spend a lot of times and a lot of parts of our day just retrieving documents, someone asking us them for an email, and each time it takes us 10 minutes to get them. And when you look at the productivity losses from that sort of thing, it is massive in many companies. I get dozens of those emails a day, and it's such a pain. So they've created a tool, very simple, doing one thing very well right now, which is that you don't need to go to that person, you go to the AI, and it will then go through all the different folders, all the different shared folders, and it will come up with what it believes is the best match for that. And sometimes if it's in my hard drive, for example, then it will actually come to me and say, is it okay if Justin gets this? Would you, and then it will take it. So I never have to waste my time getting asked, and the other person gets something right away. Well, think about that for an agency of 50,000 people and all that massive productivity gains from that simple thing, changing that around like that. And so that's what we're seeing, a lot of those sort of new tools coming up.
And maybe before you start, let me throw out another question there. Staying on the kind of off-the-shelf part for now, what kind of metrics do we need in this space to actually see the progress? Because one of the things that was striking to me was, what was it, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we had this whole data center consolidation initiative where we had been doing cloud computing in government for a while, and people started asking, well, why don't we see how many data centers we have and see if we can reduce it? And once they started counting, they realized they had a lot, and then they tried to reduce it, and then suddenly the number ballooned again because they found all these other data centers that they didn't even recognize that they had. And it seems to me there's something similar maybe going on where there's opportunities to identify, first of all, here's kind of the recommended buy list, basically, of off-the-shelf services that now are usable and proven valuable, so every agency doesn't necessarily have to prove that value each time. And second, can we actually track the numbers here? So how many human translators do we have versus using through AI, or how many schedulers do we have versus using it through a back end, and actually getting good metrics. So just like we tracked electrification, throughout organizations as a key measure of the economy, can we measure and track metrics for the AI application of government?
Yeah, so I'll leave part of my response to Justin from the GSA, because I think that's most of this question is clearly in his bailiwick. I started this conversation saying that government is primarily a service provider. So I think one way we all measure our service providers is just the happiness, the quality of the services we're receiving. So yeah, I think you can do hardcore metrics on, we had 100 translators and now we have 54, and that might show 46% improvement or something like that. But I think there's also a way that you can measure citizen engagement, which is a very big part of local governments for sure. I think the smaller the government, the more connected you are to it, the quality of the services you're receiving at your house, in your neighborhood, the safety of your neighborhood, the quality of the new businesses that are moving into your area. All of those things I think can be measured by the service being provided by the government. And I'll just leave it at that and hand it over to Justin.
So one of the things we're working on with agencies right now is how to even evaluate and prioritize what is a low-hanging fruit and stuff like that, because there's so much that could be there and there's so many steps that could be taken, but what is the smart one strategically? And so there's methodologies that are being worked on, and if people have ideas and already have that, please share that with us, because I know he's already writing that down probably. But again, this is the type of thing that we're developing now, which is even how to prioritize based on that. The devil's greatest victory, they said, was convincing mankind he didn't exist. Well, the worst thing in government innovation is people who say that you can't manage and measure things that are new like this, and that to be experimental, that you can't have some of these metrics in place. So one of the things that are so excited is that when they come down and say, okay, and this happens, comes from Secretary's office, comes from Administrator's office, we need to show how we're doing more with less. I've heard about these things, we've talked about them, I know that you go to this stuff, show me how we can do more with less so we can report that up and we can make this happen with not in a year from now, but even looking at 100 days, and then everyone's toes curl at that, get excited, because that's a real problem to be able to go. And so they're things you constantly hear, so hours of effort is the easy one right there, where people who even don't have an expert understanding of this stuff will come to the table and I think there's about 500 hours of effort that I can remove or automate with this process. Could you show us how it can be done? Or just using the same resources, tasks completed. Look at call centers, the fact of how many uncompleted calls or contacts that there are because humans are busy answering the same 10 questions over and over again. They're not free to focus on things that require subject matter expertise. So there's A, reduction in hours, B, there's increase in tasks being able to be completed with the same resources, but overall it's the narrative of how are we doing more with less. And when government agencies are asked to do that, they should be talking to their people who are passionate about robotic process automation, passionate about emerging technologies, because that is the answer.
Yeah, I think, Daniel, I think that's a really brilliant idea and a way of looking at this. And something that I actually believe, because of our data analysis that we've already done, that we could get there, something like that. So we know now that the federal government spends 400 million hours a year documenting, recording information. We know now that it's about 300 million hours a year are spent handling objects. We can go through all of these different things. We know how much time is spent doing call center work. We know how much time is doing finance, how much time is done doing strategic planning and so forth. So we have that data. And what we've also done is say, for all of those activities, what's the automation potential between high, medium, and low, based on a lot of work that's been done. And you can then go from there, where right now we're not doing very much you can start tracking that over time. And I think, hopefully you all hear that. I think that is the way to look at this, tracking AI like we did electrification. I think that is how we need to be thinking of this across agencies, across the economy, and so forth. And then looking at it again from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective. Now, I just wanted to, just for fun now, give you guys some examples of some things that AI is doing right now out there, which are a little bit out there maybe. So we are seeing AI guessing passwords from websites about 1/4 of the time. We're seeing AI which can scan your brain to reconstruct faces with high degrees of accuracy. It's AI, and this is very controversial, to deduce, one project to deduce sexual orientation. AI, which is transforming basketball through Second Spectrum and other things in terms of how people look at basketball teams and how they go about preparing and so forth. There's an AI investment advisor you can now go to, where basically AI is doing every element of the investment and taking the human kind of subjective analysis out of it. But those are just a few examples. There's another interesting one, which is a lot of AI's, machine learning is all about prediction, essentially, being able to predict better than humans by looking at lots of different data from the past. And there's now an AI which is popular at the state level where they will predict which bills will become law, okay, with a high degree of accuracy, about 85% accuracy. And then the other thing they predict is how the different lawmakers are actually going to vote. And they do that ahead of time. So I'm sitting there in front of 200 legislators, and that's what they're talking about, because it kind of freaks them out right now, because there's already all these predictions based on AI, and if they feel like, well, if they vote that same way, then they're just automatic. But those are the sort of things that we're going to be seeing in terms of just much, much more accurate ability to do prediction in all sorts of different cases.
Thanks. And so I want to move to this question of away from off the shelf and into kind of roll your own AI. And I mean, the reason we're having this conversation right now about AI in government and AI in so many industries is because of cloud. It's because we've taken algorithms and kind of the innovation that would happen there out of maybe a remote lab and put it into the cloud. So when you see these improvements, they're integrated immediately into services that are then being deployed, and people are integrating them with new services through APIs. So, Alex, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of basically how you see this intersection between cloud and AI, and then specifically, with government. Federal government specifically has tried to do a lot in the last few years to make it easier for agencies to use the cloud. How is that working? Is it working well? Is it going to work well for AI? Is there anything that needs to change?
So again, maybe a biased response, but I don't think you have a really effective AI platform without the cloud. I think if you look at all of the devices that we're carrying, you think about just the connections in your car, you think about autonomous vehicles, the amount of data we're going to be collecting from this day forward is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. And so from a cost perspective, you're not going to allow your team to innovate and fail fast if it costs $850,000. But if you can have someone spin up an instance in the cloud, collect some data, run some algorithms, turn the machines off at night, and that costs you $2, all of a sudden you're going to see your agency in your state be a lot more innovative than it has in the past.
Justin, why don't we go to you just in terms of does that match with what you're seeing right now when you're looking across all these agencies?
Oh, definitely. That was one of the first things when we started this program, the Emerging Tech program, that we ran into, is that agents, we've started having pilots in intelligent personal assistants. It was the lowest hanging fruit possible. How do we use pre-existing open data and plug it in things like Amazon Alexa, Google Home, things like that, in order to just test out the capabilities of like multilingual 24/7 services. It's supposed to be very easy, quick pilot. We thought it would be a mitzvah if we've got 6 agencies participating. We had to cut it off at over 3 dozen, which is when we started getting the inkling of how ready the federal government was to move forward on this. What happened is all these agencies came to the table, and then some of them ran into the wall that they weren't there yet with the cloud underpinning. And so here they were, passionate about moving forward on things that you need your cloud act together to really move forward on. And it's like, it was a waking up moment in a way. So for this stuff, that's what we're talking about, compartmentalization and realizing that everyone's a stakeholder, is right now we have agencies that want to move forward and tap into AI and cannot, because they need to do the first step first. You know what I mean? Which is look at all these other processes that then go into it. So that is definitely something we saw as a lesson learned. That's definitely something that's being communicated. And like I said, it was a wake-up call that agencies have to take a holistic look and not just compartmentalize.
So we talked about some of the kind of maybe technology hurdles or other organizational hurdles there. Are there human skill hurdles that we have in federal agencies right now? Do we have the right workforce to not only get the off-the-shelf part, but if they're starting to develop their own applications, do we have workers with those skills? Do we need to do more to, for example, the Department of Commerce set up a data science academy. Before, do we need to have something similar where we expand that to really focus on let's train our technical workers who voluntarily want to do this how to use the Amazon API, the Google API to use these services, and so they can start playing around with them immediately.
Yeah, so I think there's several parts to that. Number one is certainly like just whether it's AI or even digital savviness, that there's going to need to be a real massive sort of reskilling of existing employees in all sorts of organizations, public and private. AT&T has a program right now where they pledge to try to reskill 100,000 employees to get up to a certain level of digital savviness. What they've done is they've said, here are the skills that we believe you need now in this digital AI age. 17 kind of core skills, and then people test against that to see where they are. And then they've set up with Sebastian Thrun, who is the founder of Udacity, a whole series of MOOCs that people would take to start get up to that level. In the UK, they have the UK Digital Academy, a similar sort of model, which is a boot camp to take people for 3 to 5 weeks, and they go in there and they get up to at least a certain level where they have certain sort of understanding of AI. So, and that gets to, I think, Danny, your notion of getting to a certain level in terms of Amazon and so forth. Secondly, I think it's recruiting from different places and different students. So it's not only one of the key skill sets I think we're going to need in the future is design thinking skills, and also the ability to design the human to computer interfaces. And a lot of those courses and doing that stuff are not at traditional schools. They're actually at like the Savannah School of Art and Design, or they're at RISD, or they're at places like that. And so starting to think about those, because the design piece is really, really important. And then also looking at other schools. I just spent some time at my alma mater, UCSD, going to a lot of the AI labs and so forth. They're graduating 600 undergraduates a year in machine learning alone. So at some of these schools, we're seeing a real uptick, and they have also a whole design school, which is working with the folks in AI on all of their different projects. And it's really tapping into those sort of skill sets, because I tell people, think in 3D. The 3 major revolutions going on in business and society are data, digital, and design. And what you want to do is have teams, that multifunctional teams that have those different sort of skill sets and bring them together. Because you could do all of the data analytics you want and all the dashboards and all that, and if people don't use them, you're not making any progress at all. And we've seen that with some of the previous technologies. That's why you need people with design thinking too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the announcements that Bill spoke about earlier from Amazon Web Services, we just announced last week a couple of foundational programs around AI. One is Amazon SageMaker, which is essentially like a managed service for AI, and it kind of really eliminates the complexity and technical problems that a lot of people have with a lot of pre-run notebooks and pre-configured instances there. And then the other one we announced was Amazon Lens, which is a high-definition camera along with compute power inside of that camera as well. So you're talking about computing at the edge. And again, that's a foundational program allowing people to learn and just test out things, because I think what we're realizing is there is a lot of retooling that's going to need to be done. There's going to have to be a lot of tinkering, right? And so we're just trying to build kind of foundational components that people can get on and learn.
Yeah. So please take it in. Let me throw out a question, and you can also respond to the first part. And I want to open it up to audience Q&A in just a minute. So this will be my last question as well. So I want to come to this concept of inclusive innovation that I started off talking about, especially in the context of small and large organizations. So I have no doubt, for example, that the DC government will be able to do great things with AI. I have no doubt that some of our largest agencies, the federal government, can do great things with AI. What about the smaller agencies, the smaller cities, those who are going to look at this and say, I have technical staff, obviously, but I'm still not sure if I can spend time on this. What do they need to be thinking about? How do we make sure that they can quickly learn to focus on specific problems?
I think these actually tie well together because I'd written down we need more, and then underlined it a few times, there is such a demand and there is such a need for more training and education available to federal employees and program managers and decision makers and policy makers all around this and a better understanding. Amazon has done such a great job providing those opportunities. NVIDIA has really moved forward in doing that, and we need more. And if you build more, you share it with us, we will share it with the entire US government community on it. Because again, anytime you bring something to the table, we will hit send and send it to every program so they know that they can access it. And I promise you we'll need more on top of that. Now, how we work with organizations big and small on it, again, is the understanding that this is not all just one size fits all, and that coming to the table right now, requesting these programs are not just giant agencies. We're talking about townships and across the country, counties are coming to the table, all asking for these things and all looking to you for it. And so that's the type of what we're talking about is when we need more of it, it's also recognizing the fact that it's not just training purely for data scientists or this, you know what I mean? That there's a holistic approach that needs to be taken to educate people, to create stakeholderships and things. And if you create that and you can help us with that, I promise you we will help champion it.
Yeah, I actually think that, we're in the AI spring right now, and a lot of these parts of the technology, whether it's computer vision, machine translation, others the performance is increasing at an exponential level right now. Just in the last year, we've seen remarkable advances in some of these areas, which means that it's going to be very, very difficult for any small agency, whether it's at the city, county level, or even this very small federal agency, to do these things in-house and keep up with it. Virtually impossible. So I think that's going to push even more towards shared services. When I talked about a lot of the best examples of automation being within some of the shared sort of services, I think we're going to see more and more of that shared services, and the AI will be driven there because you can do this at scale. Secondly, I think this is another big reason for software as a service and cloud-based, because basically then your providers, your vendors it's incumbent on them to keep on building this into their system, and a lot of these companies are going to be spending billions of dollars over the next few years building this into their systems. Very difficult for any agency to do them themselves. And again, another thing to look at then is kind of more managed services contracts. I know a number of federal agencies right now are looking at actually setting up shared services center of excellence around data analytics and AI, which I think is pretty smart because, if you go to, like I say, USAID, they have like 7 or 8 different kind of analytics centers throughout. Why can't those be combined, and then you can bring in, I think, more serious AI tools? I was just in Canada, spent a day with the CIO and their head of their digital services there doing some things together, and they're going to invest $50 million or $50 to $100 million at the center level for an AI center of excellence that's dealing specifically with government and government sort of efficiencies. So I think we need to do a lot more of that.
I had to quickly Google the population for Washington County, Oregon. I didn't know off the top of my head it's 500,000 people. So a relatively small county in Oregon was able to spin up, again, a person of interest location system. There, I tell you to look it up yourself, that they share the code. I think Justin brought up a good point of sharing is going to be key to this technology taking off. But I think you need to choose your providers in a way that will, again, allow you to scale, learn, build a foundation, and grow from there.
All right, so we'll take audience questions. You just hold up your hand and we have a mic back there. So we got 2 in the front row here. First over here on the left.
I'll get to go first. Hi, I'm Nicole from Acadia Development Group. We're a consulting firm that works with public and private organizations to scale and implement innovation. And I just wanted to get your sense on what the public policy implications are of all of the transitions we're going to see as a result of AI. Lots of people are going to be thrown out of work. I think that's a safe assumption. In the next decade, lots of jobs are going to become obsolete. So we need policies to deal with that, because suddenly when you have a lot of people drawing unemployment benefits and now have nowhere to go, that's a big social issue. So where should companies be part of that conversation, and what should government be doing about this issue?
So I'll just touch on it real quick from the Amazon perspective, just because if you look at the size of Amazon over the last few years, one, we've been involved in machine learning and artificial intelligence for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So again, the Amazon recommendations that I mentioned earlier, hey, you bought a pair of socks, maybe like try a pair of shoes, that's an example. Our Prime drone delivery program, that's another example. If you ever had a chance to view a tour of one of our sorting facilities around robotic processes, that's another example. So we've been heavily involved in this space for, again, the last 20 years. And if you look at the number of employees that we've grown to, it's tremendous. So I don't think it's necessarily a doomsday scenario, especially from our point of view, and I'll let Justin and Bill talk about more of the policy implications.
Sure. I mean, this is one of those things that's debated forever, and I've spent a lot of time on looking at the future of work, and economists are all over the place in terms of this. But first of all, if you look back in human history, every other period of major technological change, we ended up creating more jobs from those technologies than we lost. Now, we changed, those jobs transformed dramatically. Over time, I think we'll see the same thing here. Even over the next 10 years, Forrester has said that we're going to lose 1.8 million jobs due to AI, but we're going to create 2.3 million more. I do think Amazon's one of the best examples of that, but also, you know what? We actually have more bank tellers now than we did 20 years ago. Why? Because we've reduced the cost of doing bank branches, so we've actually increased them, and what they're doing now is they're not doing regular transactions, but selling other services. So what we end up doing is you extend to new areas. There's going to be all sorts of new demands out there that we didn't have before. We're really, really poor and throughout history at predicting the jobs of the future and the industries of the future. But think about this one thing. So if you looked back in the 19th century, the job of manager did not barely exist, or professional. Now more people have that job than anything else. So we created our whole new managerial class, and then we also had a whole new 1.5 or more trillion industry in terms of tourism. Up until the last 50 years, most people didn't have enough money to do that. So we're going to be creating a lot of jobs in these new areas like human to machine design and so forth. We will be losing some jobs. We will see where it comes out. There's a lot of public policy, other implications other than jobs. There's around algorithmic bias, which we've seen a lot of problems with so far. There's around the notion of auditing algorithms and being able to audit the data. When you're looking at things like deep learning, where oftentimes the people who developed the code and the algorithms in the first place can't even explain how the computers were able to learn so quickly. How do we start auditing that? Is there an ability to even do that? So there's going to be a lot of those sort of issues, and there's going to be massive sort of ethic issues around some of the things that AIs can allow us to do around from biology and human enhancement.
In the interest of time, why don't we take another question, unless you want to quickly.
I could just quickly point to it, because this is, talking about the policy and talking about the ethics is something that federal agencies are doing every single day. Every day it's coming up between conversations with policymakers in Congress. If you point to any organization within the government that should be thinking about this, I promise you they are thinking about this every day. And the main balance that we're trying to strike in this is, how do you get agencies to feel like they can experiment and feel free to discuss that they're doing it, so it's not just happening in a silo, but not have overarching policy that all of a sudden it takes 2 years for them to update a policy that's already out of date by the time it even gets done, or heaven forbid put regulation into it. That then would obviously hinder innovation. So it's striking that balance that is something that is at the forefront of minds of people in the federal government who are responsible for that right now.
That was just a caveat on it.
So first I'd like to commend the Center for hosting the panel. Outstanding, really enjoying the conversation. And I'd like to both put a plug in and a question. The plug, my name's Mike Lennon. A hat that I'm wearing today is as a member of a social innovation think tank, which concentrates not so much on shrinking what's wrong, but growing the positive. One of the biases sometimes, let's say a government example, is automation for surveillance can be a way of increasing control versus growing solutions that might reduce crime in indirect ways rather than through more aggressive implementation. And so one of the questions that we are, the plug-in that I wanted to put in is we're going to be hosting a series of conversations that are as much about how to grow the positive as automating the existing ways of doing things. And I'll tweet that out in case folks are interested. And for you, what are the things that you think are the most promising positives, not just adopting quickly what is already, available, but like what are the most interesting innovations that you see are possible in government that aren't currently actually practiced?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long one. I've got a great slide that looks at like 30 different ways that AI is going to transform our world, and another one that looks at it from a government. I mean, it's going to help us to cure disease in all sorts of ways. It's going to help us to understand all sorts of things that we can't understand today because the human eye can't see it. So for instance, there's a big move to do regulatory reform right now and to eliminate duplicative regulations within the administration. But there's over 300,000 parts of the federal code of regulation, millions of pages. So how can the human eye do that? So we actually developed an algorithm and a model using machine learning and natural language processing where we could actually go in and look at decades of regulations and see which ones had not been touched since they started. And you know what? 2/3 of federal regulations have actually never been modified. And what we also found was that about 25% were duplicative of each other. We found that around 30% were dependent on each other, and all sorts of things like that that the human eye couldn't see. So it enables us to make much better decisions much more quickly than we ever could before. I mean, there's all sorts of great work that's looking at families who could be in danger of the children having child abuse and being able to do predictive analysis on that and be proactive, not reactive. Every single area of regulation and inspection is going to be impacted by this to allow better resource allocation, because right now there's never enough inspectors, but we're going to be able to do oftentimes 80% accuracy predicting which of those establishments or businesses actually have a problem, so sending people into the right place. It's, there's so many different ways that it's going to end up a lot of things for the better. Now, on the other hand, the surveillance piece is very real right now. I mean, essentially, it's going to be very difficult to walk around in a city anymore, or walk around and not have the cameras basically be able to do facial recognition on you and know exactly where you've gone. You're leaving all sorts of digital exhaust, so we will be losing a great deal of privacy and a great deal more than we see today, because now it's just online, but as this moves towards the physical world, where everything is, this technologies are embedded in everything, then it becomes almost impossible to kind of live off the grid even.
I want to take my moderator's prerogative to respond to that, just because we did a report filing to the FTC on informational injury. They're holding a workshop on this next week. But it gets to the question about, when are people actually harmed by, when people talk about privacy or information being released. And one of the key arguments that we make in our filing is that AI is actually enabling a lot more privacy for people. I think that's something that's underappreciated. And the reason this matters is because, traditionally, we have a lot of human processing and paperwork. That's where we're talking about all the savings. That is often personal information that's being processed by another individual, whether it's a medical system and your medical data being actually looked at by another individual, or any kind of government financial information, banks, financial systems, all that. What we see is that there's a move with AI from a kind of human interaction where humans see data that's personally identifiable to where computers are only seeing it. And that's actually a privacy benefit to a lot of individuals. It's like with the old TSA DAX card machines, the original ones, it was basically like looking at an image of the body. The new ones, it just flashes, this is the area where they want the inspector to look at. So by moving from the the human kind of strip search version to the AI algorithm version, you actually increase privacy for individuals. And I think that's something that hopefully government will keep in mind as it's thinking about where there are opportunities to actually use AI to improve privacy for individuals. So basically we take out this human element where there's sensitive information involved. So I just wanted to throw that out there, not to contradict you completely. I want you to respond.
Go. So yes, there's some of that, but at the same time, right now I can look out and there's AIs that can look at all of your facial expressions and everything and predict with about 85% accuracy whether you're enjoying what I'm saying, you disagree with it, or so forth. AIs can basically getting very, very good at predicting emotion, predicting whether you're lying or not when you're speaking, predicting all sorts of stuff. It's around what's called effective computing. And when you combine that with facial recognition cameras and everything being tied in, I mean, it really does mean that we're going to be able to have a hard time hiding our thoughts, hiding our emotions, hiding our faces, and all sorts of other things. And so in authoritarian countries, that is going to get very scary. I mean, China already has something in place where they're looking at this kind of social, they're looking at all of the different things you're doing socially and everything, and having a score, right? Adding it all up, it's going to go in place in 2020, and whether, what your rates are and different insurance and other things like that will all be dependent on that score. So, that is absolutely something that we're going to have to take a lot of precautions about, because again, the digital world is moving into the real world. So we're not going to be just on phones anymore. It's all going to be embedded in the real world, and with the overflow of cameras, there's going to be a lot of those sort of issues that we're going to be talking about from a public policy standpoint.
I have nothing to add.
All right, yeah, so please, Justin.
There you go.
You'll
Actually,
have
right
to-
before I was here, I was at the Federal Privacy Council, and believe me, they are looking at what is the role of privacy and person identifiable information in the artificial intelligence age. Just a plug for them, in fact, that they are starting to look at this.
Well, great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent conversation.